field. Blast them with your lasers or put up your shields. As a missile commander defending your city. If you're not quick enough, they'll show no pity. The invaders won't stop us from the skies they drop. Just keep coming.
3 out-of-this-world games from Atari, the #1 video computer system with more games than any other.
Everyone's gone Atari, the #1 video game.
All hail the mighty Atari 2600. For many people, this is where it all started, a system that started our love for home consoles and video games in general. So let's take a look at the story behind this formidable console. The company we know today as Atari first began in 1970 under the name Syzygy. It was founded by Nolan Bushnell and Ted Dabney with the purpose of developing a commercially successful coin-operated video game system. The company became Atari in June 1972, and later that year would release Pong, one of the earliest arcade systems ever developed. Even at this early stage, we encounter our first smidgen of controversy, as Bushnell took his inspiration for the game from a ping pong title released on the Magnavox Odyssey, the first home console system which came out that year, leading to a lawsuit. This was all settled out of court, and Atari eventually gained licensing rights to the game. During the early 70s, arcade games were garnering significant public interest and commercial success. Games like Pong and Tank became pretty unanimous in bars and arcades the world over, and their success meant that interest in home console systems was building. Imagine being able to play versions of arcade games in your living room. Madness. In 1973, Atari purchased a think tank company called Cyan Engineering with the aim of developing a next-generation home console. The prototype was named Stella, not because the team had a penchant for average lager, but after one of the engineers' bicycles. This new system's standout feature would be the inclusion of a CPU, the MOS Technology 6507, combined with a RAM chip and a television interface adapter, or TIA for short. Around that time, people were cottoning onto the fact that ROM could be housed in removable cartridges, and that this could enable additional programming features which could be utilised in games. The first cartridge-based system, the Fairchild Channel F, was released in 1976, putting the Atari team under serious pressure to get their system ready. After the release of Pong, there was a definite fear that the market would become saturated with copycat games, and so time was of the essence. In a shrewd move, Bushnell eventually sold the company to Warner Communications for $28 million in order to expedite Stella's production. One of the key members of the development team was a man named Jay Miner, who figured out a way to compress the TIA into a single chip. Once that final piece of the jigsaw was in place, the system was ready for production.
Everybody enjoys Atari because Atari has so many different games to enjoy.
Hello, Karen. No, we don't need a babysitter tonight.
No other company offers you as many different video game cartridges as Atari.
It's hard to believe how expensive these consoles were upon release, for this really was the very beginning of the home console era. Adjusting for inflation, the systems went for an eye-watering $786. The original name for the system was the Video Computer System, or VCS, a name directly designed to compete with the Channel F, which was originally known as the Video Entertainment System, or VES. The name we're all familiar with, the Atari 2600, wasn't adopted until years later, in 1982, when the all-black 4-switchers, also known as the Darth Vader consoles, were released. Over the years, there were a number of iterations of the system, including the Heavy Sixer, the Light Sixer, and the 4-switcher, all sporting that famous and iconic wood grain finish. The Darth Vader and the 2600 Junior just opted for black plastic, which isn't as nice to my eyes. For the rest of this video, I'm going to use the term 2600 instead of VCS because it's what I'm used to. The system's early years were pretty rocky to say the least. In 1978, significantly fewer consoles were sold than manufactured, meaning the company took a financial loss and once again had to rely on Warner to bail them out and balance the books. As a result, Bushnell began to lose faith in the product. He started clashing with Warner, and in particular Ray Kassar, the president of Atari's consumer division, about the direction the company was taking. He thought the 2600 was falling behind and wanted to scrap the system to work on a successor. He said, "The day that we shipped the 2600, I felt we needed to spend engineering money on getting the next one. By the time it was there, the technology had advanced so much that we could build a much better video game. Warner was horrified by the idea. They wanted to be in the 45 RPM record business and just sell records forever, and I told them, it doesn't work that way. Every 2 to 3 years you need to upgrade your hardware. And their decision not to upgrade the hardware was really what led to the collapse of the business in 1982. He was phased out of the company, and Ray would take over as CEO. Despite this potential setback, 1979 would prove to be an important year for the system, largely due to the release of Adventure. Developed by Warren Robinett, this was arguably the world's first graphical adventure game, and it had a significant and positive effect on the minds of the general public. It was becoming increasingly apparent that games didn't have to be limited to such rudimentary titles as Pong. They could go deeper, grow larger, and become much more imaginative. The release of this game, combined with the fact that Fairchild essentially lost faith in their product and flopped out of the console battle, meant that the 2600 had a monopoly in what was now becoming a significantly growing and lucrative market. By 1979, thanks to the development of exclusive titles like Adventure, the system was the best-selling Christmas gift that year, shifting an impressive 1 million units. An important decision that helped the console to stand out was the development of licensed games. That same year, Superman, the first ever home video game licensed from a movie, was released, and over its lifespan the system saw a number of Star Wars games too. It was a bit of a double-edged sword though, because the licensed ET game is widely regarded as one of the biggest flops in gaming history. That's a topic big enough for an entirely separate video though, so we'll brush that one over for now. The system's success also hinged upon the licensing of a number of key arcade conversions. Space Invaders was wildly popular in the early 80s, and its release on the system doubled the 2600's sales to over 2 million. The game's success largely saved Atari, turning its financial difficulties on their head. It's sad to note that the game's developer, Richard Maurer, was paid a paltry bonus for his work on the game, and actually left the industry in disgust after that. This is a real shame given how iconic the game was and how important its contribution to the system and the industry as a whole would turn out to be. The other very important title was Pac Man, the console's best-selling game, which sold 7 million copies worldwide. The success of the system attracted a large number of third-party developers, including Activision, who contributed such iconic games as Pitfall. As a result, the system went on to become one of the longest-standing consoles in history, spanning 15 years before its production ended in 1992, and it had to endure a lot in that time. Although we can look back on it as a resounding success, one can't simply ignore its role in the so-called gaming crash of 1983. As we've already said, by the early 80s the video game and console industry was absolutely booming, but as we approached 1985, something went terribly wrong. The console industry, which was previously worth $3 billion, fell to an estimated value of just $100 million, with a drop in profits of 97%. The cause of the crash is multifactorial, but one factor was the large number of third-party games being released on the 2600, which flooded the market with a bewildering array of titles of very varying quality. There was too much consumer choice and too little quality control, and in addition, given the success of the system, a large number of other home consoles came to the market, including the ColecoVision, which again added to the saturation. However, despite these external factors, it was largely Atari's own decisions which caused the crash in the market. As already mentioned, Pac Man sold incredibly well for the system, but the quality of the port, as anyone who's played it will tell you, was pretty shoddy. The company essentially vastly overestimated how many copies they'd sell, meaning they overshot by several million. Not only that, but the game was an example of the frankly rushed programming which would underpin the crash. The worst example was the previously mentioned ET, which took only 5 weeks to develop. Refusing to be stung twice after the poor quality of Pac Man, consumers were reticent to buy the title, meaning a huge number of cartridges were sent back to Atari. This led to one of the most iconic and amusing moments in gaming history. Piles and piles of cartridges were buried in the Mojave Desert in landfill. Given Atari's previous financial success, they were able to ride out the crash, though several other companies were not so lucky. Things did eventually recover for the industry, with Japan's amazingly successful Famicom system on the way, but Atari definitely caused a big dint that took a while to resolve. Anyway, despite that blip, the system is still legendary for its innovation, its playability, and its longevity. It was the first time most of us could play arcade games in the home, and it's a system I'll always treasure. So thank you, Atari, for your amazing gift to the world.